my nerves with the old, well, science doesn't know everything. Well, science knows it doesn't know everything, otherwise it'd stop. But it...
What exactly is science? How would you define it? We expect scientific inquiry to be based on facts and reality rather than belief and faith. However, increasingly it seems, science has become easily influenced by political agendas and ideologies instead. The very concept of what science even should look like, what even constitutes science, is seemingly therefore being called into question, as Seattle public schools have decided to ditch their traditional math curriculi requirements and replace them with an optional math as ethnic studies framework, which, rather than teaching the principles of arithmetic, instead focuses on the social construction of math as a product of colonialism and imperialism, and encourages students to create their own math, that there are no right or wrong answers, but rather that everything is subjective and socially constructed. This social constructivist perspective also affects what research is conducted, not just what we teach students. For example, although a recent study has indicated that we actually understand very little about the long-term effects of the administration of hormone blockers in otherwise biologically healthy prepubescent children, it seems unlikely we're going to end up actually learning more, as other researchers have reported their work that sought to further understand the effects of these treatments being shut down under the pretense that such research is discriminatory. After all, if concepts such as masculinity and femininity are complete products of our culture and not our biology, then any questioning of the validity of the use of hormone blockers helping children express their gender identity as a social construct with no basis in empiricism or biology, it's reasonable then, right? I can feel many of you shaking your heads in disbelief and frustration right now, but hang on. Consider this from the social constructivist perspective. If everything that we call gender is just a product of cultural norms and has no basis in biological differences, to deny hormone blockers to children is not a medical problem, but a societal one, and would be an expression of biological bigotry to deny them. But how do we get to the point where even questioning the idea that gender is a social construct is seen as heretical and shuts down research that is desperately needed? Well, I think we can find some answers in the Confessions of a Social Constructivist. Recently, Dr. Christopher Dummit, an associate professor of Canadian studies, and yes, that is a thing, eh?
I don't know the Six Nations, but I know the Tri-Cities, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo.
Penned an article in Quillette that described his work on the study of masculinity, which has, in a small part, informed the current state of academic social constructivist perspectives on gender, and, to use the technical terminology, was complete horseshit. Specifically, in his book, The Manly Modern, Masculinity in Post-War Canada, he discusses how men expressed masculinity through barbecuing. And yes, that's something researchers actually do study. But they were colonizing, in a sense, a traditionally feminine stereotypical behavior, cooking, but in doing so in a manner which emphasized masculinity and power, being haphazard and safety and embracing their own incapacity to cook well, in order to regain some power that they felt was lost to them, to women who had become thrust into more traditionally masculine roles during the Second World War, working in factories and industrial occupations. He describes his thought process in the writing of his book as overwhelmingly and utterly absent of questioning whether or not masculinity and femininity could be in any way due to genetic differences between men and women, as after all, such things were self-evidently a product of socialization, of nurture rather than nature. Yet despite his intense historical work in understanding and cataloging the language used by post-war Canadian men in describing barbecuing, when it came to applying these historical realities to their underlying potential societal meaning, he was just making it up, all to fit his pre-existing expectations and beliefs, influencing the current academic zeitgeist, which similarly views the human animal not really as an animal, but as a blank slate, a ghost in the machine, a noble savage, which is unaffected by genes that comprise its corpus. He believed, because he had been taught to believe so, that it was unquestionably true that masculinity was an expression of power over women. And thus, when he began to work on his book, he took this concept as self-evident, needing no real evidence to support it, but rather only searching and sifting through historical documentation to support his presuppositions. The notion that it could be anything other than social constructivism never even occurred to him. He openly apologizes for the role his work might have played in allowing the current state of science to be similarly denialistic of biology, which in part essentially has allowed for the likes of people like Jessica Yaniv to abuse the concept of gender as social construction in order to gain their own influence and power. And in the words now even of the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, use the law as a weapon. Yaniv's complaints to the tribunal against biologically female aestheticians for refusing to wax the beanbag are based on this very same perspective, that because Yaniv identifies as a woman, and because gender is a social construct, Yaniv must be treated identically to a biological woman, at least in the minds of a younger Dr. Dummit, many current grad students, and academia it seems at large, who view gender entirely as a social construct that can be just as easily deconstructed, because it is based only on cultural norms. Therefore, research that seeks to understand it further from a biological perspective is simply bigotry. How could this have become the state of science, which is supposed to be empirical, rational, and supported by evidence? Yet, as we see in the admissions of Dr. Dummit, he was just ultimately faking it until making it. So what is science? Let's quickly define it. Dr. Karl Popper, half a century ago, and preceded by the likes of David Hume and Immanuel Kant, give us the basis for which most scientists should operate, based on the principles of empiricism, that is observation, quantification, that is measurement, and perhaps most importantly, falsification. Yet it seems that there is no capacity for falsification of certain ideas when that idea is seen as self-evident, so self-evident as to be unquestionable. For how can you falsify a universal truth? The only option, it seems, is to refuse falsifying at all.
I reject your reality and substitute my own.
For a long time, the social sciences have been criticized for their inability to produce replicable results. This does include, for us and for other fields, the problem of falsification. For without replication, there cannot be falsification. Dr. Stephen Schmidt, in a 2009 piece for the Review of General Psychology, notes that replication is nearly absent in the social sciences. You could say that replication went out for a pack of smokes and didn't really come back. And this is due in large part to replications just being kind of uninteresting, and thus remaining unpublished in favor of novel findings. The manifestation of this tendency can be found in the work from Nosek and colleagues, who in a 2015 report to Science replicated 100 studies published in the top psychology journals and found 97% of original studies had reported significant results with a p-value of less than 0.05, meaning that if the study were conducted 100 times over, we would only expect a different result in 5 of those 100 retests. However, in the actual active retesting, they found only 36% of replications had significant results. Those of you who have played XCOM might know the sting of 97% actually being 36. This discrepancy is due in large part also to something called p-hacking. P-hacking is the manipulation, intentional or occasionally not, of data to produce statistical significance, which is easily done by adding additional data or retesting over and over until that 95 confidence interval is reached, and then can be used as the crux for a scientific argument, and has become so widespread that it's no wonder many in the social sciences do see science as socially constructed, because p-hacking allows researchers to do just that, to socially construct their findings, and we've seen it with terrifying frequency. This means that social constructivists are not entirely wrong, and it is true that
science is a liar sometimes.
Many times, in fact, particularly when we simply do not replicate studies, and p-hacking has become so normative, and moreover, because many people in the sciences simply don't care to check their own biases and instead just make it up. Despite more and more journals now discounting p-values and confidence intervals in favor of beta weights and coefficients of determination, and so on, it's no cure for the reality that science is a liar sometimes. How then did science come to find itself in such a dire strait, so at odds with everything we've described as foundational to the concept? Today, let's look at the history of biological denialism, the rise of social constructivism, as well as address the suppositions that Dr. Dummit made in his work about gender roles lacking any biological component, why he may have believed such a thing without question, and what this all means for science. But before I go forward, I have to tell you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for people who desire to teach themselves, and if you want to escape the intellectual echo chamber that is the academy and learn both at your own pace and focus on the things that you're truly passionate about, then Skillshare is the best and biggest place on the web to grow your own knowledge, talents, and skills. With more than 5 million teachers and over 18,000 different classes, Skillshare allows you to let your inner autodidact flourish. The courses cover countless topics, from graphic design to business and marketing, as well as more general knowledge. Being a social science sped myself, I have to recommend a few courses I've come across on criminology and psychology, which will be linked below, taught and administered by PhD scholars on the subjects. But as someone who loves art, I'll also once again recommend this course, The Art and Science of Drawing, which provides a fantastic introduction to understanding lines and space in art, and provides you with a foundation upon which to base your own artistic work. And it's just one of the countless courses you can check out for for free if you click the link in my description and get a 2-month membership to Skillshare, which allows you to access the entirety of their catalog of courses. You can cancel at any time, no harm, no foul, and see for yourself if the service is right for you. Even if you don't want to keep the membership, you can keep your non-premium membership and check out plenty of the free courses that exist without having to pay a penny. If you like it or love it, it's just $8 a month to maintain access to thousands of classes on just about any topic under the sun. So, if you want to educate yourself,
Try it out. Try it out, you know?
Anyway, with my shilling out of the way, and perhaps to move into an actual hour-long continued commercial for Skillshare, and why you should be an autodidact, let's talk about the history of biological denialism. Dr. Dummit is far from the first in the line of scientists who have asserted the absolute truth and unquestionable self-evidence of social constructivism, but surely he could not have come to believe these things unquestionably in a bubble. After all, if we are a product of our society, and we live in a society, how could Dr. Dummit have come to find himself as a graduate student completely incapable of even humoring the idea that gender might not be entirely a social construct? To understand that, we need to look at the history of biological denialism. Cognitive psychologist Dr. Steven Pinker, in his book The Blank Slate, in which Dummit references in his piece, provides a thorough refutation of the concept of man as a complete tabula rasa, a blank slate, molded entirely by environment and not at all by genetics, and describes the socio-political circumstances that helped create the environment that Dr. Dummit surely found himself in as a young grad student. I will describe these briefly, but I highly recommend that you check out Dr. Pinker's book, which will be linked below in the description, because there's just no way for me to cover it all here. But let's quickly describe this history. The great tragedies of the 1800s and early 1900s, slavery, lynchings, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, produced a scientific culture that was terrified of the possibility that man could be anything but a blank slate, a product exclusively of nurture and not of nature, when such notions were, certainly, used as a rationale for such great suffering, prejudice, and bigotry. It is well documented that Darwin's theory of evolution, and specifically the work and concepts of his fellow scholar, Herbert Spencer, the man who actually coined the phrase survival of the fittest, gained popularity in Germany beginning in the mid to late 1800s. The survival of the fittest concept was incorporated into baddie. Thanks YouTube for forcing me to talk like a toddler, by the way. Propaganda films, such as Alles Leben ist Kampf, All is Struggle, which promoted the sterilization of the disabled and infirm. Social Darwinism, applying evolutionary perspectives to human society, or social Spencerism more aptly, was favored by the likes also of laissez-faire capitalists and fellow supporters of eugenics projects, such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, the latter of whom was such an ardent fanboy of Dr. Spencer that he referred to him as my master in communications and wrote of him in his autobiography, "Few men have wished to know another more than I know Herbert Spencer," which makes me think he wanted to know him in a biblical sense, if you get my drift.
I wish I had a chance to know that Jean-Luc Picard. Perhaps we should loosen things up a little bit.
I'm not of the opinion, as some scholars attest, that Darwin, Spencer, and Ernst Haeckel, the man often called the German Darwin, were actively responsible for the ways in which their ideas and research were abused, in using that research to provide seemingly logical and scientific explanations for the differences between culture and the sexes, did give credence to notions of eugenics and genocide, such that Rockefeller and Carnegie considered themselves to be progressives, because such notions were based on science, not in faith. Philosophically, science should be empirical, falsifiable, and quantifiable, which puts it inherently at odds with religion and mysticism, things we can't measure and we can't falsify. After all, it was not in response to Darwin and the atrocities that his work was used in the name of, to which Locke, and I mean, come on, have you even read Locke, originally described man as a blank slate, or more specifically, a scraped palate, but instead a response to the church and the concepts of predestination and original sin. Thus, in response to the abuse of science, it was seemingly easier to just scrape the palate clean of the study of man itself, and all notions of biological or evolutionary aspects, by returning to the philosophers of old, including Locke and his tabula rasa, as well as two other doctrines that Pinker states have become sacred in their own way to quote-unquote science, in large part as a response to the said abuses of Darwinism, those being man as the noble savage and man as a ghost in the machine, drawing from philosophers Rousseau and Descartes respectively. Man as the noble savage posits that all evils in society are a result of society itself, The idea is that without civilization, we'd all be out on the plains, living like Indians, dressing like Indians, and doing all the simple, beautiful things you Indians do. This is a key component of many social constructivist arguments and can be well summarized in the concept of patriarchy, that without the history of white male imperialism, everyone would be equal in all ways, all suffering would be ameliorated. Therefore, the solution is to decolonize science and espouse things like math is oppressive due to its contributions being made predominantly by old white men.
Science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off.
Man as a Ghost in the Machine, in contrast, draws not from the mistake known as anime, but from the concept of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, by presenting the mind as fundamentally disconnected from the body. To paraphrase Descartes, although the mind controls each of its parts, we are aware that we will our fingers to type, our legs to walk, yet if you cut off my finger or cripple my legs, nothing is taken away from my mind. Taken together, these three ideas, these doctrines, provided an alternative explanation in favor of social constructivism, with it being easy to reject any claims of biological input on the human animal by simply accusing those that claimed to the contrary of heresy and, moreover, fascism, because they had seen that biology had promoted such ideas in the past. We can easily see this today, where for years now, scientists have reported being afraid to publish any research that might question the doctrines that they ascribe to. For example, looking at the protests on college campuses of people like Dr. Charles Murray, or the resignation of Harvard Dean Lawrence Summers, all for simply proposing that there just might be a little bit of evolutionary and biological component to human society and behavior. We can also see this historically and in the dire outcomes such rejection of biology, particularly when fighting it by just screaming fascist at somebody, has had in the implementation and development of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. Lysenkoism was an anti-genetics agrarian movement founded by Trofim Lysenko in the 1920s, which was not only responsible for the arrest, dismissal, and even execution of over 3,000 biologists under Stalin, but also stymied advancements in agriculture and kept the nation teetering on the verge of famine for decades, all because genetics had become associated with fascism. The end result, in the words of former Premier Nikita Khrushchev, was that Soviet agrarian research spent over 30 years in darkness. And I would argue that the denialism of genetic components in society in the study of social sciences and the dogmatism toward the tabula rasa concept has similarly left the social sciences in darkness for decades, as can be well summarized by historian Carl Degler, who writes of this trend being indicative of an ideology or philosophical belief that the world could be freer and more just place, played a large part in the shift from biology to culture. Science, or at least certain scientific principles, or innovative scholarship, also played a role in the transformation, but only a limited one. The main impetus came from the will to establish a social order in which innate and immutable forces of biology played no role in accounting for the behavior of social groups. Using the concepts of the blank slate, man as noble savage, and man as ghost in the machine, social scientists thusly, much as with the Soviet agrarians, form a new type of religion of social constructivism to the exclusion of evolution as heretical to the order. By the time Dr. Dummit was writing his book and providing his own contributions to this field of social constructivism, the concepts had become unquestionable to the faith. For to even suggest anything to the contrary would surely make one guilty of promoting the same ideas that inspired fascism and eugenics. Social scientists deny that they hold these beliefs as sacred, and much as with the Lysenkoists, they developed their own brand of science, and posited that claims to the contrary generally arise only from fascistic ideology rather than earnest scientific inquiry.
Combined with a spirit of bold curiosity for the adventure ahead.
Many of you may likely be familiar with Dr. Richard Herrnstein and Dr. Charles Murray's now infamous book, The Bell Curve, which to this day protests erupt in response to on college campuses anytime Murray dares step foot on one to give a speech, to the sound of screeching cries of racist and fascist. I guess they're more bell jar than bell curve, but Murray was far from the first to face these cries of crime for suggesting a biological component to human society. No, he was long since preceded by the attempted character assassination of Dr. E.O. Wilson, a biologist and naturalist who specialized in the study of ants. Yet in his 1975 book, Sociobiology, in which he uses evolutionary perspectives to describe the development of communication, altruism, aggression, parenting, and sex roles across different species in the animal kingdom, in the 26th and final chapter of his lengthy work, he dared to apply the same principles to the human animal. And even in 1975, social constructivism had become so integrated into scientific dogma, and the human mind so isolated from evolution and biology, so mystified as a ghost in the machine, as a tabula rasa, that he was accused of what else but fascism. In a scathing review of the book published in the New York Times, Dr. Elizabeth Allen and her colleagues wrote of sociobiology that these theories provide an important basis for the enactment of sterilization laws and restrictive immigration laws by the United States between 1910 and 1930, and also for the eugenics policies which led to the establishment of gas chambers in the batty Germany, and accused Wilson of espousing the salutary advantages of genocide, and that his analysis frames institutions such as slavery are made to seem natural in human societies because of their universal existence in the biological kingdom. All of which was either gross exaggeration or overt misrepresentation of Wilson's work. For example, Wilson did not claim there was some vast genetic dissimilarity or superiority between the human races that existed and excused slavery. Quite to the opposite, in fact. He wrote, "There is little evidence of any such hereditary solidification of status, and that human populations are not very different from each other genetically." However, once the baseless claims about Wilson and his supposedly vile suggestions that humans might be products of evolution like every other animal species had been disseminated, his lectures began to be protested, and it reached a crescendo. At a 1978 speech he was set to give at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, when one protester arrived carrying a swastika sign and shouting, "Racist Wilson, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide." Sound familiar at all to you? History repeats itself, I suppose. Some of Wilson's harshest critics, including Dr. Richard, let's call him Dick, Lewontin, wrote extensively of their disgust both for the book Sociobiology and for Richard Dawkins' book The Selfish Gene, in their 1984, well, apt year, Not in Our Genes, wherein their need to so vehemently defend the sanctity of social constructivism as doctrine that they outright, and I'm guessing intentionally, misquote Dawkins, printing that he had written, "We are controlled by our genes," when Dawkins had actually written, "We are created by our genes." Yes, even Richard Dawkins was accused of propping up the kinds of ideas that inspired eugenics programs and slavery for simply suggesting that human society was influenced at least in part by biology. The book was both lauded and criticized, because while the writers may have liked to play at objectivity, their clear Marxist political beliefs, which the likes of Lewontin publicly identify as, only harkens back to the attempts at silencing of evolutionary science enacted by Stalin and the Lysenkoists. Only this time the silencing came in the form of career assassination, rather than actual assassination. Although I can't say I would be shocked if Lewontin and his comrades didn't occasionally daydream about taking Wilson and Dawkins and, in their devotion to the social constructivist altar which they worship, christened instead as a sacrificial one, by shoving them both into a gulag. But hey, much like the BS accusations they tried to pin on E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins, that's just speculation. Mine just happens to have a little bit more basis in potential reality.
Therefore, everything is gay, but that's just a theory. A gay theory.
By the 1970s, science had ceased to be scientific. Instead, it had become overtly and openly, even brazenly, political. That's no surprise why 3 decades later, Christopher Dummit, a graduate student trained to believe unquestionably in the same dogma Lewontin and his colleagues were so desperate to defend, would never even consider that anything other than social constructivism could explain men's barbecuing behavior in post-war Canada. Can we really blame Dr. Dummit for, in his own small way, possibly contributing to the current discussions of there being limitless genders, and kind of allowing, if not creating, the likes of Jessica Yaniv, who saw such a rife opportunity to abuse the system that this has produced? I would say no. It must have taken more balls than hopefully any more female estheticians are bullied into busing for Dr. Dummit to write this article for Quillette, to admit his own faults. But his experiences are merely part of a series of events which were put into place well before he published his book on masculinity, and had resulted in a culture where anyone daring to question, no matter how innocuously, the doctrine of social constructivism so outside the socio-political context as to result in career success. Outside of this history, though, we must ask, why else would one be prone to believe, unquestionably, that gender is a social construct? Now that we understand more about the context and the history and kind of intellectual spiraling of theory into fact and doctrine, I want to look specifically at the premise of Dr. Dummit's research that led him and others to believe that gender is socially constructed, using his same line of reasoning, and as such try to explain how data can be manipulated when you start with a goal in mind. Dr. Dummit approached masculinity by studying the ways in which men talked about barbecuing in post-war Canada. And again, yeah, that is a real thing that academics really do spend their time on. But before you thoroughly ram your face through your desk in agony of the seeming inanity of the onus of the study, it's actually kind of a neat approach, particularly if one begins with the supposition that gender is all a social construction. But hang on, let me explain. As Dr. Dummit's early work contends, men's position of power over women, which is the societal constructivist concept of what masculinity is, was called into question following the Second World War, wherein women took up some traditionally masculine roles. And to reassert this power over women, men began to take some traditionally feminine roles, in this instance cooking, barbecuing, but in a way that again emphasized brutishness, by barbecuing poorly, eliciting images of cavemen around the fire.
Today I got up, I stepped onto the grill, and I clamped down on my foot. That's it. I don't see what's so hard to believe about that.
And that in adopting this traditionally more feminine behavior was evidence of how gender is socially constructed. Dummit's assumptions that presentation of gender change over time are actually not inherently wrong. After all, high heels were once worn exclusively by men. Is there any evidence that gender really is socially constructed? The classical measures of femininity and masculinity in the anti-Darwinian, anti-naturalist sciences were both developed in 1974 via Bem's Sexual Inventory and Hallmark's Personal Attitudes Questionnaire, the PAC. These questionnaires measure the masculine and feminine using adjectives associated with the sexes to determine what traits are seen as more or less desirable when associated with either gender. And particularly, Bem's Sexual Inventory instrument continues to be one of the most common methods of measuring gender norms, as a Google Scholar search shows over 11,000 citations of the scale, including over 1,500 in just the last 4 years. We can quickly find support for Dummit and his colleagues' hypothesis that gender is socially constructed precisely by using these instruments and in their inability to remain stable over time. Twang 1997 found that in the 2 decades since the BSRI and PAC instruments were developed, the desirability of gender stereotypes had in fact changed. Precisely, women's average desirability rating of stereotypical masculinity, as measured by Bem's instrument, increased by 0.8 standard deviations over that time. While men also increased slightly in positive perceptions of masculinity, it was far less so than women who also increased in their positive perceptions of androgynous adjectives. The result was that the difference between men and women's scores on the desirability of gendered perceptions became smaller as years passed. Similar, albeit weaker findings were forwarded with Twang's tracking of the PAC instrument as well, with women expressing more desirability towards masculine traits over time. For social constructivists, this must seem like definitive evidence that there is no biological component to gender, for if there was, then men and women would want to identify with the same masculine and feminine stereotypical adjectives over time, and find them similarly desirable. Even the lack of change in men's scores could be explained, much as Dummit does, in that just because women come to adopt more masculine traits, because masculinity is about power over women and dominance, men are in no way aided in the maintenance of that power by becoming more positive towards feminine attributes. Thus, even while men take on more feminine roles, such as more childcare or housework, they don't adopt more feminine adjective preferences, because such descriptors do not aid in their power maintenance. In Dummit's description of men's barbecuing and the language used to describe it, men were engaging in a traditionally female stereotyped behavior, cooking, while still using masculine-coded language to describe that behavior, explaining this lack of change. Nearly identical results were similarly reported by Holt and Ellis 1998, who found that the difference in mean scores between men and women decreased on ratings of masculinity, with women reporting more masculine adjectives as socially desirable for either sex, such as acting as leader or self-reliance. Feminine traits were viewed generally as less socially undesirable in the 1990s sample than they were in the 1970s, with only 2 exceptions: loyalty and cheerfulness. In other words, both masculine and feminine adjectives were seen as more appropriate and more desirable for men and for women over time. In more recent research, and this comes from a graduate school poster presentation, and although I did contact their faculty advisor for the full data, she hasn't gotten back to me. Probably not her fault, I'm sure she's busy. Seriously though, give me that data. I want that data.
I want mommies and no others. Give it. Give it. Give it now.
Anyway, Their abstract indicated that as of 2019, only 35% of feminine adjectives were still considered significantly more desirable for women, whereas 50% of masculine adjectives were considered significantly more desirable for men. They found that 20% of the feminine traits and 5% of the masculine traits tended to be perceived of as more desirable for the other gender. In other words, it seems that what is seen as desirable for the genders has changed. But does that mean how people see themselves in regard to gender roles has changed? Since men and women both have come to view masculine and feminine traits as more attractive over time, does it also mean then that women and men come to view themselves as more masculine and feminine over time? Choi, Fuqua, and Newman 2008 replicated a study from Pethauser and Tettenbaum 1979 in assessing both the desirability of masculine and feminine traits, as well as the degree to which people use those adjectives to describe themselves. Much as with Twang's research and that of Holt and Ellis, Choi and pals found that masculine traits were viewed as more desirable for both men and women in the 2000s than they were in the 1970s, with a reported average increase in desirability of masculine traits in women by 0.34 over time. For feminine traits, similarly, they found that these adjectives were viewed as less undesirable than they were in the past, both for men and for women, with an increase of the desirability of feminine traits for women on average of 0.21 points. While this mirrors the data we've already looked at, in the 30 years since Pethauser and Tettenbaum had originally assessed personal identification with gendered adjectives, unlike desirability, virtually nothing had changed. The degree to which men described themselves using masculine language and women described themselves using feminine language was almost identical in the 2008 sample as it was in the 1979 sample. That is, while changing social norms may make things like independence and self-reliance more attractive for women, and traits like tenderness more attractive for men than they at least had been in the past, women and men continue to describe themselves using the same language that they had 30 years prior. This presents a major issue for the social constructivist. For yes, we can easily see that what society finds acceptable and desirable as an expression of masculinity or femininity in men and women does change over time. How people describe themselves generally does not. After all, we wouldn't exactly call the dress and style of Louis IV the pinnacle of modern masculinity, would we? Well, maybe some might.
I ain't even scared of no bees, especially in this Marc Jacobs bee uniform.
Dummit also reminds us of another of his favorite examples, being the seeming flip that occurred in the association of pink with females and blue with males, when, as we can read in Ladies' Home Journal in an article from 1918, quote, "The generally accepted rule is pink for boys and blue for girls. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and strong color, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl." So clearly what is desirable for men and women can change, at least on the outside. But that doesn't indicate that everything or even much of what differentiates men and women is also so easily malleable and can be changed as frequently as one changes one's clothes. If that were the case, then we would expect how men and women describe themselves and feel about themselves in regard to gendered norms to similarly have altered as desirability for masculine and feminine traits have altered. But that's just not what we see in the data. Now, a social constructivist would likely point to Choi, Fuqua, and Newman's data and say the lack of change is merely an expression of the patriarchy, causing women to continually describe themselves using feminine qualities despite recognizing masculine traits as more desirable. But why then have men also come to see the feminine traits as less undesirable than they did in the past? As Dummit admits in his mea culpa, his education and background were so heavily rooted in the history of the tabula rasa that to even consider an alternative hypothesis never occurred to him, not really. I'm sure many of you, my dear viewers, think that this itself is self-evident. Of course men and women are different, but without showing it, we are just as guilty of that same self-evidential belief that Dummit was. And it is not self-evident to social constructivists who find their own beliefs as self-evident and who can easily look at the same studies cited above and say that they are only further proof for their belief and views as human beings as a ghost in a machine. For this reason, I want to draw primarily from social science research to illustrate how, perhaps inadvertently, the very denialism of biology in playing a role in the behavior of the sexes actually provides us some evidence for a biological aspect of our nature. To do so, since we've seen the way gender roles have changed, let's look at the ways in which personality and gender have remained stable. While there are plenty of things we could look at which differ between men and women, when considering gender roles and the persistence of some traits being more self-identified as masculine and feminine over time, even as what is socially desirable changes, personality differences between the sexes should give us a better idea of whether or not everything that comprises gender roles is socially constructed. We've looked at ways of measuring masculinity and femininity and how desirable these traits are. But how are these propensities towards the masculine and feminine expressed? I and many other scholars would argue that it's through differences in how men and women behave, both in terms of their personalities and their interests, hobbies, and chosen occupations. Stereotypically, women are supposed to be caring while men are supposed to be dominant. Women are supposed to be interested in childcare, teaching, nursing, arts and crafts, and cooking, while men are supposed to be interested in sports, strategy, competition, and jobs that solidify their patriarchal positions of power. Lawyers, policemen, politicians, right? Well, let's see if any of that is true and if there are gender differences in terms of interest, occupation, and personality, and if social constructivism really is the explanation for these differences rather than biology. One of the most common ways of measuring personality traits is via the Big Five, which assesses the traits of extroversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, which is essentially just a tendency to follow the rules. A review of meta-analyses regarding the Big Five from LIPA 2010 on these personality variables and how they themselves vary across the sexes indicates consistently that women are considerably higher in neuroticism and agreeableness than men are, while men tend to be more likely to be open and more extroverted. Conscientiousness is a bit of a toss-up in that some studies find men and women are about equal in conscientiousness, and others find it to be a more common trait in women than in men. Additionally, these massive studies find consistently that men tend to be much more object or thing-oriented, while women tend to be more people-oriented. Men and women also tend to, regardless of age, prefer different occupations, as we can see in data from Weisgram, Bigler, and Leib in 2010, who found that women and girls consistently tended to have a greater interest in stereotypical feminine jobs, such as elementary school teacher or hairstylist, while men and boys consistently were more interested in masculine occupations, such as computer scientist or police officer. We can actually see these differences in play in demographic data as well, as, for example, data from a 2016 Australian census indicates that 95% of childcare professionals are women, while more than 98% of electricians are men. These occupational differences have remained relatively stable over time, as a comparison of US Census data from Carrier 2012 found virtually unchanged percentages in major occupational fields between 2000 and 2010, with women making up 88% of healthcare support professionals in both years of data collection, but making up only 13% of computer repair technicians in 2000 and 15% in 2010. These differences are so obvious that it's kind of no wonder social constructivists would look at these trends and say, here, this is proof. This is a manifestation of gendered norms being socially constructed. Women are socially encouraged to be agreeable, to go into feminine fields. It doesn't matter if they say they prefer those fields. No. They only prefer them due to social pressure and social normative behavior, just as men only prefer masculine fields that give them positions of power over women as a result of nurture, not of nature.
Look at your arms. Yeah, they look like they belong in the workplace, don't they?
But if that's the case, we should expect to see a strong correlation between agreeableness in women and interest in more feminine occupations and hobbies, right? Evidence from LIPA 1998 seems to indicate not so much. Across a series of studies, LIPA found that personality differences were less strongly correlated to occupational choice, measured using Holland's career typology, than were gender diagnosticity. Gender diagnosticity sounds complicated, but it's really just a tendency to prefer things that align with one's sex. The only personality variable LIPA found played a significant role for both men and women in occupational choice was openness to experience, which, as we've seen, tends to be more common in men than in women. More open men and women both preferred more artistic and less conventional occupations, but other personality traits generally mattered little, if at all, particularly in comparison to gender diagnostic preference for masculine or feminine occupations, predicting both men and women higher in masculine-typed gender diagnosticity preferred realistic positions such as architect or engineer, and were disinterested in artistic professions such as photography or music. For women, openness was negatively related to enterprising careers, such as, well, entrepreneurialism, yet women who held more masculine gender diagnosticity were also averse to social occupations, such as teaching, which generally we've seen women tend to prefer. Additional studies found similar results for gender diagnosticity preference for hobbies and activities, as well as occupational interest, and this was particularly potent in occupations that were people or thing-oriented rather than idea-oriented. A final study in this set of male and female twins also indicated a potential genetic component in occupational preference and its relationship to gender and personality variables. Again, masculine gender diagnosticity in both males and females, to a similar degree across twins as well, was positively related to thing-oriented, realistic occupations and negatively related to artistic, social, and people-oriented occupations. Once again, the only personality trait that was related to job preference was openness to experience, and it was negatively negatively related in both men and women and shared about evenly between twins to artistic and social jobs. What this means is that women can be interested in more stereotypical masculine professions when they are also more object-oriented, less open, and again, expressed more masculine gender diagnosticity. What's interesting here, though, is that personality types, which we know differ between the sexes, were really not related to job preference. Instead, personality and occupation seem to be independent from one another and between the sexes.
Find me an anthropologist that dresses like this and I will eat this headdress.
The twin studies also let us know that there's a possible genetic element at play, given the similarity between twins assessed in the third of LIPA studies. What is the relationship between personality, occupational choice, and other measures of masculinity and femininity, then, that we've already looked at? LIPA 1991 had previously correlated Heinrich's Personal Attributes Questionnaire and BEM's Sexual Inventory with the Big Five personality instrument and gender diagnosticity in relationship to activities of interest outside of pure occupation, and did find some influence of the Big Five. Generally, for men, neuroticism was negatively related to most hobbies, but for women, neuroticism was only significantly related negatively to occupational preference, and agreeableness negatively related to everyday activities. Still, overall, and once again, personality differences were pretty meaningless in comparison to gender diagnosticity, indicating that personality traits actually have very little to do with traditional gender roles and interests in terms of hobbies and occupation. Personality just isn't a strong predictor of whether or not people will engage in hobbies or in jobs that are traditionally seen as more masculine or feminine. In contrast, LIPA found considerably more significant correlations with BEM's sex role inventory and Heinrich's PAC instrument to personality traits than occupation and hobbies. Specifically, neuroticism was negatively related to both BEM and the PAC measures of masculinity in both genders about equally, while extroversion and openness were positively related to masculinity similarly about equal across both genders and both instruments. Extroversion and openness were also both, to a generally smaller degree, related to measures of femininity as well. While there was no relationship between either measurement of masculinity and agreeableness, being agreeable was strongly correlated with femininity in both cases and both sexes. Finally, while masculinity and femininity were both positively related to conscientiousness, the relationship was more robust for all variables in women. To put this all into perspective, what comprises the way people think about gender and sex roles is related to their personality pretty consistently with the way we also find the Big Five to align consistently with gender differences in those personality variables. We know women are consistently more neurotic, but also more agreeable, and occasionally more conscientious, while men tend to be more open to experience and extroverted. The fact that personality was generally unrelated to occupational choice, but strongly correlated to gender identity, indicates that these personality variables do not preclude behavior in terms of job and activities, and instead that men and women tend to prefer to do different things regardless of their personality differences. What this all means is that despite the fact that personality differences exist across the sexes and have been generally stable over time, as we saw in the various meta-analytic data, that men and women are just kind of different. But it also means that these differences do not drive men and women inherently towards different hobbies or occupations. Women being more agreeable is not why women are more likely to be caregivers, and men being more extroverted does not explain intrinsically why men are more likely to take hazardous jobs. The correlations simply are not there. This leaves us with an interesting set of possible explanations and a lot of questions. If gender was a social construct that is entirely based on social norms of what is considered to be acceptably male or female, even taken into account the persistence over time of different traits in personality, then we can say that that persistence of personality is based on people developing those traits around supposed gendered norms. That is, we could say that women aren't really more neurotic than men intrinsically, but rather that neuroticism is a product of their environment encouraging them to be more neurotic. But do the data really support that idea? Weisberg, de Young, and Hirsch 2011, in their meta-analysis of Canadians between the ages of 10 and 90, found that while, yes, conscientiousness was higher in women and steadily increased for them as they aged, it also increased in men over time. When looking at specific dimensions of conscientiousness, precisely orderliness, while women tended to be more orderly in their younger years, by age 65, they were considerably less orderly than men. Men's orderliness, in comparison, increased consistently into later life. Similarly, volatility, a measure of neuroticism, was highest in young women and decreased as they got older, falling below the average volatility in men, which remained mostly stable across the lifespan around age 50. But Aiden, I say to myself, people obviously stop caring about conforming to gender norms as they get older and their field in which they cultivate their simply dries up. Well, we can actually see similar findings in just looking at adolescents, as illustrated in Vecchione et al. 2012, in their assessment of Italians between the ages of 16 and 20. Arguably the time period wherein gender norms are the most salient as young adults become, well, you know, interested in the opposite sex.
I'm 17. Looking at linoleum makes me want to have sex.
Again, while women were generally more agreeable, around age 18, that agreeableness started to sharply drop, and while they were also more conscientious, the gap between men and women began to coalesce as they both aged. In contrast, interests and hobbies appeared to be far more stable than personality traits. As a rather dated, and I do apologize for the graphs here I'm about to show you, but hey, it is what it is. In a study from Hansen, 1988, assessed longitudinal changes in men and women's preference for certain careers and individual activities and hobbies between 1930 and the 1980s, so both before, during, and near the end of the height of the women's liberation movement. He found very little variation in women's mean preference for different job orientations via Holland's typology, across the decades and across several different occupations, such as youth program director, which remained virtually unchanged in all preferences except for conventionalism, which typically concerns attention to detail, and while others, such as life insurance agents, increased in preferences for all areas related to their job. Across the 6 occupations he assessed, there was virtually no change with the interests and hobbies these women enjoyed across the various decades. Men actually saw far more change in their preference for occupations and in their interests and hobbies than women did, although the general finding was similarly to changes in the ratings of masculinity and femininity in desirability, in that it basically became more acceptable for men to have more traditionally feminine hobbies. While women changed very little in their own interests, men's changing interests resulted in a decreased discrepancy between the mean interest ratings for men and women in more traditionally feminine hobbies, with, for example, the mean score of interest in art and nature being 7 in favor of women in 1930. This difference had decreased to 5 for artistry and 4 for nature in the 1980s due to men's increased interest in these activities, but not due to women's decreased interest. Further, Sue Rounds and Armstrong 2009, more recently in their own massive meta-analysis using data drawing back from the 1960s up to the 2000s, and I mean, woo-wee, look at these studies, in awe of the size of this data set, the absolute unit.
I have achieved huge level XXL.
Found similarly that men and women's interests tended to remain stable, with women consistently preferring social and artistic professions, and men consistently preferring realistic and investigative jobs. They found age had almost no effect on interests across the lifespan, with the only difference being a smaller gender disparity in the older generations on preference for social or engineering occupations. Interests and hobbies also tended to be stable across individual lifespans, as another dummy-thick,
perfectly huge
meta-analysis from Lowe et al. 2005 illustrates, again, that interest tended to be stable from early adulthood through middle age, and that this stability was present in both men and in women for different hobbies. Additionally, they found the stability was relatively consistent regardless of age cohort, and while it was more stable in arguably more stable times, tended to be more stable than people born in the 1930s, stability only increased as time went on. It also seems that interests tend to crystallize in the mid to late teens and then remain stable into adulthood, as Tracy and Robbins 2005 found that with the exception of preference for realistic, more scientific and data-driven occupations, which steadily increased over time, by the time that students were in the 8th grade, their preference for occupations and interests were more or less solidified, regardless of race or sex. The largest difference for job preference was not age, not race, not cohort, but gender. As the researchers found, girls had a strong preference for social jobs and boys for realistic jobs, with very little effect of age. If gender norms are completely socially constructed, we would expect girls and boys to much more closely match gendered personality traits as they are being socialized into them, particularly in adolescence. Yet that doesn't seem to be the case. Further, if there are no innate differences between the sexes, why is it then that men and women consistently and persistently over time have different preferences in hobbies, activities, and interests, yet this preference is not only unrelated to personality differences, but also remains stable even as desirability for masculinity and femininity has changed over time? Lippa's data present a pretty fascinating incongruity for the pure social constructivists. As if everything about sex differences is a product of society, we would expect women to be more likely to be teachers and nurses because it is socially acceptable for women to be agreeable and conscientious. Yet no such relationship exists. And we also find no change in women's interest in these occupations and women's interest in more traditionally feminine hobbies, even as desirability for masculinity in women has increased. Instead, it seems it's not all socially constructed, and there's something in our genes playing a role here. And to understand exactly how, we gotta look at those genes. Where all of this connects to genetics directly can be seen in any number of studies which indicate our personalities are, to a significant degree, a product of our genes. So prepare to go a little full Kojima.
Means the DNA of the soul.
To test this, we need to look at identical, monozygotic, and non-identical dizygotic twins. Because monozygotic twins share 100% of their DNA and dizygotic twins only half, we can compare the two types of twins to assess how much of any variable is due to genetic input and how much is due to environmental input. If you've made it this far, well, first of all, congratulations, but I hope you're ready for some pretty hardcore scientific data, because despite my best attempts, it's really difficult to explain what follows in simplistic terms. But hang on, I'll try to the best of my ability. Zhang et al. 1998 assessed a sample of 660 monozygotic pairs and 380 dizygotic pairs of Canadian and German twins raised together. Because they were raised together means they cannot isolate the effects entirely of shared environment, but they found that all 5 personality variables were more strongly correlated by about twice as much in the identical monozygotic twins than in the dizygotic ones, and all to a pretty similar degree, with 0.50 for extroversion, 0.48 for agreeableness, 0.49 for conscientiousness, 0.49 for neuroticism, and 0.48 for extroversion. This study, and others like it however, such as the work of Llewellyn, typically require twins to give their own self-reports of their own levels and ratings on the big 5 personality traits, which is a pretty major possible confound when you're asking people to describe their own personal personalities. But a study from Reimann, Antlinger, and Strehlau in 1997 on German twins both raised together and raised apart, allowing for the effects of shared environment on the monozygotic twins to be assessed, also included ratings from 2 peers of the twin as well as their own self-report, and found significant genetic influence on their personality. Their findings were even stronger in favor of genetics than Zhang and his colleagues, with genes accounting for more than half of the variance in self-reported traits. Only one trait, agreeableness, was potentially explained more by environment than by genes alone. Taking all of these factors and peer reports into account, the researchers found correlations with personality traits due to additive genetic variance. Additive genetic variance is the deviation from the mean phenotype. Phenotype is the observable characteristics of an organism due to inheritance of a particular gene or allele, and this allele's relative effect on that phenotype. And for personality traits, they found the additive genetic variance was 0.60 for extroversion, 0.57 for agreeableness, 0.71 for conscientiousness, 0.61 for neuroticism, and 0.81 for openness. Once again, they found that the effects of shared environment were negligible in contrast to genetic components, ranging from 0.25 in openness and peaking at a correlation for environment of 0.38 for extroversion. As part of their analysis of mono and dizygotic American twins, Llewellyn et al. 1998 assessed possible sex differences. As with previous research, they found all 5 personality traits were heritable, with an average of 55% of individual personality traits explained by genetic differences and 45% explained by environmental differences. They also did find sex differences, specifically in 2 variables that we also find to be consistently related to masculinity and femininity in ratings of Big 5, neuroticism and extroversion. Specifically, women's neuroticism was a greater product of genes than men's neuroticism was, and men's extroversion was a greater product of their genes than women's extroversion. Thus, we can see, to a pretty significant degree, and as Kojima has told us, our personalities are influenced by our genes. But it doesn't stop there. As Lycan et al. 1993 illustrated, so too are our interests and hobbies. The researchers collected data from more than 4,000 male and female twins, including dizygotic twins and monozygotic twins raised both together and apart, to determine the importance of shared environment, and asked these twins about their occupational interests and hobbies from a list of 291 factors, truncated down to 39 items and 11 super factors, which included more stereotypically female hobbies such as sewing and occupations such as teaching, and more stereotypically male occupations such as military or police work, and stereotypical male hobbies such as wait, what? Blood sports?
So Scrub, I heard IBS imploded. What happened? Gay.
Anyway, as with personality traits, the correlations between the set of twins having the same interest was half for both the full list of the 291 factors and for the truncated 39 items and superfactors. To further see how stable these interests were over time, the researchers retested their sample 3 years later and found consistent results. Specifically, they reported a mean heritability of 0.66, and because the heritability of a trait is equal to the square root of the correlation between genotype, the genes themselves, and phenotype, the observable characteristics, which can be influenced by environmental factors, was 0.81, meaning that genes were strongly correlated to the expression of those genes when it came to interests and occupation. For any single item, any one hobby, talent, or job, the researchers reported a correlation of 0.57 between the genotype and that interest, the phenotypic expression. This is all a very complicated way of saying that the things that we like and the things that we do, in addition to how we behave and generally who we are, is explained by more than half by our genetics and less than half by our environment. When it comes to stability, talents such as being persuasive were more stable over time than mere hobbies, and when it came to desired occupation, women were nearly 3 times as likely to express desires to work in the same field as their twin, 28% in women compared to 10% of male twins. It would not only be silly, but outright wrong based on the data to say that nothing of gender norms, including personality and interests, is based on our environment and our society. For although we've seen these things are, to a significant degree, heritable, genes far from explain 100% of the variance in individual differences in phenotypic expression. Genes are not deterministic. You are born with your stats, but you determine which feats to take. And despite what many social constructivists like to claim, evolutionary biologists and psychologists really think, just because you are male or female does not predetermine what you can or cannot be. Not only because correlation does not equate to causation, and not only because we're looking at stats on average, but because people have individual agency. And environment does, as we have seen, play a role here. Even in these studies of genetics and heritability, differences in culture often were not taken into consideration, which may produce people with the same genotypes yet forward rather different phenotypic expression based precisely on cultural norms, which we can look at by examining differences across cultural groups. Going back to Weisberg et al.'s data, Asian Canadian women are much less compassionate than were white Canadian women, with compassion being a sub-measure of agreeableness, while white Canadian men were much more volatile, again a sub-measure of neuroticism, than Asian Canadian men. Additionally, Schmidt et al. 2008 looked at a plethora of existing research on personality differences between the sexes in 55 different countries and found major differences in individual traits across cultures. For example, while there are huge sex differences in neuroticism scores for men and women in the Middle East, in contrast, there are virtually no differences in extroversion between the sexes in Southeast Asian cultures. Overall, the researchers found that men's personalities tended to vary more than women across cultures, with women generally being more static in agreeableness and neuroticism than men were in extroversion or openness. This all makes sense though, right? After all, the studies we've looked at tended to indicate that genes contribute a little over half, perhaps more, to our interests and our personalities. But that means that the rest is a product of our environment. It's a product of individual cultures and societies, and to a degree, therefore, the ages in which we live. However, the stability of interests and personalities over time do differ between men and women, and the persistence of that stability, even when reported desirability of masculine and feminine traits has changed, indicates that genes do have a large role to play here, and that means that there is more than just a little bit of evidence to suggest that gender is not entirely socially constructed. And that's really all it takes to collapse the claims of social constructivists who insist that gender is completely a product of nurture. As with most things, it's kind of more complicated than that, to quote Tim Pool. Any scientist who insists something about human society is completely biological or completely social is ultimately engaging in greedy reductionism. They're essentially taking a myopic view of reality, which is useful in some of the harder sciences, but is simply inadequate to explain something as complicated and complex as human society and behavior, as a square peg being incapable of fitting into a round hole, being itself inexplicable by the study of molecules alone, and instead also needing to include the understanding of concepts such as rigidity and geometry. For this reason, hierarchical reductionism, that is, using individual expertise and combining your expertise with other scientific perspectives, is what ultimately allows us to arrive at a greater understanding of the world. And with that, let's come to some conclusions. While working on this video, I found myself saying at points How could anyone believe something as complicated as human behavior and society is entirely a social construct, when our multifaceted nature is clearly a product of both nature and nurture? After all, it's just self-evident. Now, I mean, I more accurately probably just said something to myself like, bruh, this is dumb. But in thinking such a thing, I revealed my own biases, which we do all have. Myself and others, such as Dr. Pinker in his book on the blank slate, which again I highly recommend, believe in the value of scientific collaboration, mixed methodology, and interdisciplinary study. However, in even thinking that to myself, that such a notion is self-evident, I have betrayed my own bias. Thus, I wanted to go through and really show how there are biological and social components to gender expression and gender norms. If we never question our suppositions, we end up in a position much like that Dr. Dummit describes, who, to his great credit, was able to overcome the cognitive dissonance that he likely felt and recognize his own failure in his earlier work, falling victim to that bias and allowing it to color his interpretation of history. And once again, this all brings us back to the importance of falsification. Again, it's not entirely Dr. Dummit's fault. No, the fault lies more indirectly in a history of biological denialism based on many socio-political factors than it ever could on a single individual scientist. And I cannot, without sounding like a fangirl, express how much I admire exactly what Dr. Dummit has done in writing this piece, and we need more scientists to do the same, to pay it forward. We all need to look at our beliefs from the perspective of falsification, for without falsification, if we hold certain things as overtly self-evident, well then no contrary information can ever be entered into the matrix, and thus science dies in the darkness of self-evidence. I implore you too then, dear viewer, to question absolutely everything, every belief, every single thing you yourself may find is self-evident, because without falsification, without replication, we find ourselves in a similar conundrum as Dr. Dummit.
Much more important to teach children to question what they read. Children should be taught to question everything, to question everything they read, everything they hear.
I've been guilty of it before. Have you? Have you ever challenged your own beliefs on things that you thought were self-evident? Do you think that gender identity is more socially constructed, more biologically constructed, or a combination of both? Regardless of what you thought before, I hope I've given you some food for more thought on this topic going forward and entertained you at least a bit in this long scientific ramble. If you were entertained, consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing if you're not already subscribed, and if you are, consider hitting that bell, because people don't often get notifications for my videos since, we now know there's YouTube blacklists. As always, a massive thank you to my absolutely wonderful and beautiful supporters on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Streamlabs. Thank you guys so much. Without you, none of this would have been necessary. None of this would have been possible. Once again, if you want to teach yourself and treat yourself, consider clicking the link below and signing up for 2 months free from Skillshare. As a quick note, my last video was sponsored by NordVPN, and they have been a sponsor of my channel for some time now. It's a service that I still use and have used for a long time and continue to use in the future. But after the last upload, I learned of a data breach in their servers which occurred back when I was just a customer and they were not my sponsor. I still stand by Nord as a customer, but I'm going to hold off on advertising for them in the future until I'm absolutely sure that they really are the best choice for you guys. After all, it would be incredibly hypocritical of me to spend an hour talking about the importance of falsification and admitting your own faults without admitting this was a potential fault. It'd be a little bit hypocritical, eh? Just a little bit. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to this video. I hope you had fun, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.